40,000 Marines landed on Iwo Jima. Nearly a third of them became casualties before the island was declared secure. And the men carrying nothing but an 8-pound rifle and 8 rounds in the chamber were the ones who had to walk straight into it, yard by yard, position by position, for 36 consecutive days. This is the story of what the M1 Garand riflemen actually faced on that island, and why the weapon in their hands was simultaneously the finest infantry rifle in the world, and never quite enough for the specific hell they had been sent into. To understand what happened to the riflemen at Iwo Jima, you have to understand what the island was before the Marines ever stepped off their landing craft. Iwo Jima is a volcanic island roughly 8 square miles in total area, as sitting in the western Pacific approximately 660 miles south of Tokyo. It had no meaningful civilian population, no natural resources worth capturing on their own terms, and no strategic value that could be measured in anything except geography. What it had was location. American B-29 Superfortress bombers flying from the Mariana Islands to strike the Japanese home islands passed within radar range of Iwo Jima on both legs of every single mission. Japanese radar stations on the island provided approximately 2 hours of advance warning to home island air defenses on each incoming American raid, and Japanese fighter aircraft based there could intercept damaged B-29s attempting to limp back across the Pacific after a mission over the home islands. American planners calculated that capturing Iwo Jima would eliminate that radar warning network, neutralize the fighter threat entirely, and provide an emergency landing strip for crippled bombers that would otherwise go down in open ocean with their crews. The strategic logic was sound and the operational planning was detailed. What neither the logic nor the planning fully confronted was the specific nature of the defensive system that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months constructing on that island, and what it would actually require from the individual riflemen to overcome it hour by hour and day by day. The M1 Garand was the standard service rifle of the American infantrymen in the Second World War, and by any objective measure, it was the finest general-issue infantry rifle in the world at that time. General George Patton famously described it as the greatest battle implement ever devised, and in the context of 1945 infantry weapons, that was not hyperbole. The M1 was semi-automatic, meaning it fired 1 round per trigger pull without requiring the shooter to manually work the bolt between shots, a capability no other major military power had managed to field reliably at scale in a standard infantry weapon. It fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip inserted directly into the receiver, which ejected automatically with a distinctive metallic ping when the final round was fired. It was accurate to approximately 500 yards in trained hands, weighed approximately 9.5 pounds fully loaded, and fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge. A full-power rifle round generating enough energy to penetrate light cover, defeat standard steel helmet protection at extended ranges, and deliver reliably lethal force well beyond the distances most Pacific Island fighting actually required. Private First Class Charles Lindbergh, a flamethrower operator who fought alongside M1 riflemen throughout the Iwo Jima campaign, noted in later accounts that the Marines carrying Garands moved with a visible confidence in their weapon. They had trained extensively with it, they understood its capabilities completely, and they trusted it without reservation. That trust was entirely justified in the conditions the weapon had been designed for. Iwo Jima was not those conditions, and the distance between what the rifle could do and what the battlefield actually demanded was going to cost men their lives every single day for over a month. Whereas the M1 Garand fires a .30-06 cartridge that leaves the muzzle at approximately 2,800 feet per second, generating kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate several inches of solid hardwood or light steel plate at standard combat ranges. At 300 yards on a conventional range, a trained Marine could place every round from an 8-round clip on a man-sized target with consistency. The semi-automatic action gave him a sustained rate of fire roughly 3 to 4 times greater than the bolt-action rifles most of his opponents carried, allowing him to engage multiple targets in rapid succession without breaking his sight picture or giving a target time to move between shots. And in a conventional infantry engagement, 2 forces exchanging fire across terrain where targets were visible and distances were measured in hundreds of yards, The M1 armed Marine had a decisive advantage over essentially any opponent he was likely to face in the Pacific theater. But here is where it gets interesting, because Iwo Jima was not a conventional infantry engagement by any definition that existing doctrine had prepared anyone for. The Japanese defensive network built by Kuribayashi consisted of more than 1,500 individual fortified positions connected by approximately 18 kilometers of tunnels excavated directly into the volcanic rock beneath the island's surface. The men defending those positions were not standing in the open or crouching behind field cover. They were firing through apertures the width of a man's shoulders, and from positions reinforced with concrete and overhead volcanic rock that no .30-06 round could penetrate regardless of how accurately or repeatedly it was aimed. The M1 Garand was a devastating weapon against a human body at any range. Against 3 feet of reinforced concrete and volcanic rock, it accomplished nothing. On Iwo Jima, the enemy was almost always behind one or the other, and the riflemen had to find a way to solve that problem with a tool that had not been built to solve it. The odds stacked against the Garand riflemen went deeper than the fortifications alone, and this is important to fully understand before the main events of the battle begin. The volcanic ash covering the southern beaches where the Marines landed was so fine and loose that men sank past their ankles with every step, and turning the kind of rapid fire and movement that infantry tactics depended on into an exhausting, slow-motion struggle just to reach the first line of Japanese positions. The broken ground further inland, a landscape of craters, ridgelines, and rocky outcroppings produced partly by the pre-invasion naval bombardment and partly by the volcanic geology of the island itself, eliminated long sight lines completely. The average engagement distance on Iwo Jima was not 300 yards, where the M1 Garand delivered its full performance advantage. It was closer to 30 yards, frequently less, in terrain where a Japanese position was completely invisible and entirely silent until the moment it opened fire and someone in the squad went down. And the Japanese defensive doctrine on Iwo Jima had been specifically engineered to neutralize the advantages the American riflemen brought to the fight. Kuribayashi had ordered his garrison not to meet the Marines on the beaches in the conventional defensive stand that American naval gunfire and air support would rapidly demolish. His men would wait underground, allow the first waves to land and move inland, and then open fire from multiple directions simultaneously once the assault force was committed beyond the beach and could not easily pull back. The rifleman's greatest advantage, precision fire at range against a visible, identifiable target, was neutralized by deliberate design before he ever took his first step off the sand. The assault on Iwo Jima began at 0902 hours on February 19, 1945, when the first waves of Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches on the island's southeastern shore. For the first 15 to 20 minutes, the landing proceeded in a silence that veterans later described consistently as more frightening than any combat noise they had previously encountered. The pre-invasion bombardment had ended. The landing craft were grinding onto volcanic sand. Men were struggling forward through loose ash, and the entire Japanese garrison was underground, following orders, waiting. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, 17 years old and serving with the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, recalled in later interviews the specific quality of that silence. The certainty that the island was fully manned combined with the complete absence of any information about where the fire would come from or when. Then, at approximately 0922 hours, the Japanese opened fire from every prepared position simultaneously across the entire landing zone. Pre-registered mortar concentrations dropped onto the beaches and the approach routes leading inland. Machine guns and concrete emplacements opened on men crossing exposed ground. Artillery pieces on the slopes of Mount Suribashi to the south and the Motoyama Plateau to the north, positions registered over months of preparation, began working the landing zone in systematic overlapping patterns. The Marines who had been moving carefully forward found themselves in a crossfire from positions they could not locate. On ground, they could not cross quickly, carrying the finest rifle in the world and facing a problem that rifle had not been designed to solve. What the fighting looked like from inside a Marine rifle squad was documented in enough first-hand accounts that a consistent picture emerges clearly. A squad would identify a Japanese firing position, usually because someone had just been hit, and bring all available M1 Garands to bear on the aperture. 8 rounds per man, the metallic ping of ejecting clips cutting through the noise between bursts. The rounds struck concrete and rock. The position kept firing. The squad leader would call for the BR or attempt to push a fire team around the flank for an angle on the opening. The flanking team would immediately take fire from a second position, sighted specifically to cover the blind spot of the first. Corporal Tony Stein, a 23-year-old Marine from Dayton, Ohio, serving with the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, spent the entire opening day making repeated individual charges against Japanese positions using a modified aircraft weapon he had personally converted for ground use before the landing, drawing fire deliberately onto himself to allow his squad to maneuver and gain angles on each successive position. He was killed in action on March 1st, 12 days into the battle, and was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His story was not an exceptional outlier in the context of Iwo Jima. It was a precise representation of what the situation required from individual men every hour of every day, because the terrain and the fortifications were the limiting factor, and the only available means of overcoming them was a man willing to physically close the distance under fire. The picture from the Japanese side of those same engagements reveals a tactical reality that made the rifleman situation even more desperate than it appeared from the outside. Japanese defenders in the tunnel network were operating under standing orders that specifically prioritized preserving fighting strength through the early phases of the American assault rather than maximizing immediate casualties. Positions were manned in rotation. A defender would occupy a firing aperture, engage the advancing Marines briefly, and then withdraw through a connecting tunnel before concentrated American fire could be accurately directed at the opening. The Marine rifleman who correctly identified a Japanese position maneuvered at genuine personal risk into a flanking angle and delivered accurate sustained fire on the aperture would frequently reach that position and find it empty. The man he had been trading fire with was already moving underground through the network, heading laterally toward a different position. This allowed a garrison of approximately 21,000 men to function as a defensive force that was simultaneously present everywhere and pinnable nowhere. A rifle company clearing a ridgeline at 1400 hours could find those same positions reopened and actively firing at 1600 hours, because the tunnel network allowed defenders to return faster than the Marines could consolidate what they had just taken at cost. The M1 Garand was a precision instrument built to kill a man you could see at distance. Iwo Jima was a battlefield deliberately engineered so that the man you needed to kill was underground, or not behind rock, and consistently somewhere other than where you last saw him. Let me give you the numbers, because without the numbers, the full weight of what 36 days on that island meant does not register properly. The battle for Iwo Jima ran from February 19th to March 26th, 1945. Total American casualties reached approximately 26,000, approximately 6,821 killed in action, and roughly 19,217 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Of approximately 70,000 American personnel committed to the operation, the overall casualty rate was approximately 37%. More than 1 in every 3 men who stepped onto that island was killed or wounded before it ended. Among rifle platoon leaders, the junior officers and staff sergeants leading squads into Japanese fortifications every day, the casualty rate approached 75%. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 men suffered around 18,800 killed, with only approximately 216 taken prisoner. For direct comparison, the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, itself considered catastrophically costly, killed approximately 1,000 Americans in 76 hours. Iwo Jima produced those same casualty numbers in the first day and a half, and then kept producing them for another 34 days without pause. The battle generated 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single engagement in the entire history of the United States military. And that number alone tells you what kind of fighting it was. Not coordinated tactical maneuver, pressing a positional advantage, but individual men walking toward problems that no weapon they carried was capable of solving by itself. The full weight of it surfaced in the veterans slowly, over years. They described the experience not in terms of specific firefights or particular moments, but in terms of a cumulative erosion of physical energy, of sustained fear, eventually of the ordinary psychological distance between a man and the violence happening immediately around him. Private First Class James Buchanan, who fought with a rifle company of the 5th Marine Division through most of the campaign, described in a 1980s interview how fear had eventually stopped being a sustained experience, not because the danger had diminished in any way, but because his body simply did not have the resources to maintain it across 36 consecutive days. The island became, he said, its own form of normal. As chaplains attached to Marine units during the battle reported consistently that the men they ministered to were not primarily asking about death. They had settled that question before they ever boarded the landing craft. What they were asking about was meaning, whether what they were doing and what it was costing the men around them amounted to something that would matter. The riflemen carrying M1 Garands across that volcanic rock against an enemy they could rarely see and almost never engage on even terms were not questioning whether the rifle was adequate. They already knew the answer to that. They were asking whether they were. 36 days, 26,000 casualties, 27 medals of honor. The M1 Garand was the finest infantry rifle in the world in February 1945, and on Iwo Jima, it was not enough. And the men who carried it went forward anyway. They did not go forward because they believed the rifle would solve the problem in front of them. They went forward because there was no one else, because the position was still firing, and because the man beside them needed them to move. That is what the Garand rifleman at Iwo Jima actually was. Not a marksman pressing an advantage his weapon gave him, but a man closing the distance towards something his weapon could not fully handle, because closing that distance was the only option that remained. The island asked for everything they had. They gave it without reservation, and most of them are buried there.